The mighty, prosperous Germany. For years, a symbol of opulence, productivity, and good work. We are talking about a country known not only for its premium cars, such as Mercedes and BMW, but also for shaping and pulling the strings in the European Union, for being one of the biggest industrial powers in the world, and even being the guarantor of economic orthodoxy in the old continent. Lately, however, things are starting to go awry. Recently on Visualeconomik, we told you about the rise of organized crime, and on this channel, we also told you about the huge problem posed by the growing competition from Chinese auto manufacturers. But now, to top it all off, a fiscal bombshell has been unleashed in recent months that now threatens to put Olaf Scholz's government on the ropes.
Fear and anger rise in Germany over handling of budget crisis. Germany was worst performing major economy last year.
It may come as a surprise, but the problem has reached such an extent that right now, voices are gaining strength within the country, calling for an exit from the European Union.
German far-right leader hails Brexit as model for Germany.
This is no joke. The openly anti-European Alternative for Germany, or AfD party, is soaring in the polls, and it is already in second place. This party emerged in 2013 to oppose the bailouts of countries like Greece or Spain, and now it is becoming a key pillar of German politics. Of course, all this has made Berlin and Brussels more tense than a violin string. But the question is, why are we talking about this matter on Visualeconomik and not on Visualpolitik? Because the rise of the populist Alternative for Germany party is a good example that things are not going so well in Germany. So, Visualeconomik viewers, in this video, we will explain to you exactly what is going on in Germany, what the fiscal crisis we have told you about implies, and what the consequences may be. Let's get on with it. On the 15th of November 2023, Germany's latest political and economic crisis broke out. A crisis that may have profound consequences in 2024. On that November day, Germany's highest court surprised everyone by ruling that the budget drawn up by the Olaf Scholz government for 2024 violated the constitution. Specifically, the fiscal rules that impose balanced budgets. You see, the government had planned to allocate 60 billion euros left over from an emergency fund against COVID-19 to its new Climate and Transformation Fund, one of the flagship policies of this government, and one which it has committed to invest more than 200 billion euros over the next 4 years. What for? Well, mainly to accelerate the energy transition, extend railroad lines, and also subsidize the installation of large advanced semiconductor factories in the country. To achieve this goal, the 60 billion left over from the COVID fund was key. It was, so to speak, the government's first major allocation of money to this new political commitment. However, the courts have not only overturned this transfer of money, but have also possibly killed a large part of the entire project. The courts have been very clear, so much so that no one expected it. The ruling says that if the German government wants to spend the money on this huge transformation plan, it will have to take the money out of other parts of the budget, including social welfare. So the question is, why have the German courts overturned the government's flagship policy? And what's more, have they unleashed a fiscal crisis in one of the most traditionally solvent countries in Europe? A country whose public debt as a percentage of GDP amounts to just over 60% of GDP. Almost half that of countries like Spain or Italy. Well, to answer this question, we have to travel back to 2009. That year, Europe was in the midst of the great international financial crisis. At that time, things in Germany were going much better than in the rest of the European economies, and the crisis was hardly noticed. Nevertheless, the government of the time made a decision to push through a change in the German constitution to introduce a rule for curbing public debt. In other words, it was established that the maximum structural deficit of the central government could only be 0.35% of GDP, and the regions, the Länders, would not even have that margin. In other words, the Germans shouted to the world that the German economy was an example of strength and solvency, and that under no circumstances would the financial health of the country ever be at stake. Nevertheless, Visualeconomik community, many high-level economists, such as, for example, the Italian Alberto Azzina, have already warned us loud and clear. These types of rules, with which policies are filled with medals, usually have more holes than a golf course after the attack of an army of angry moles. According to Alesina, when you want to put public accounts in order, there are two things you should not do. First, raising taxes almost never works. And secondly, spending rules are not usually the best option either. Why? Well, because in good times, governments overspend, and then when crises come and public revenues fall, it is practically impossible for them to tighten their belts. And guess what? That's exactly what German politicians did. The change in the 2009 constitution to introduce the so-called public debt brake was sold at full steam, but when it came down to it, not much has been accomplished. As they say, no sooner the law is made than the loophole appears. As soon as problems arose, the idea of limiting public spending went straight out of the window. In 2017, when the German government was in the hands of a grand coalition between the CDU and the SPD, the parliament authorized the government to extraordinarily bypass the public deficit ban in order to cope with the refugee crisis by transferring huge amounts of money to the landers and municipalities. Then, in 2020, when the pandemic broke out, the debt brake was suspended again. And not only that, but special off-budget funds began to be created, endowed with hundreds of billions of euros. Shortly afterwards, in 2022, the war in Ukraine broke out. And do you know what happened to the balanced budget? Well, let's just say there were quite a few backflips. The government boosted a fund of 100 billion euros to modernize its military. But not only that, in total, 29 off-budget emergency funds have been created in recent years to circumvent the constitutional limit. In total, according to the German Federal Court of Audit, we are talking about almost 900 billion euros off-budget and financed by debt. That is more than 20% of the country's GDP. You can laugh at the constitutional obligation to balance the budget. In other words, for German politicians, the debt brake was as serious as dieting in a bakery. Too many temptations and not enough willpower. But obviously, that's not the end of it. Now the Scholz government wants to do exactly the same thing to finance its macro fund for climate and transformation. And this is when the courts have finally said enough is enough. You see, in 2022, the main opposition party, the CDU, saw its opportunity and appealed the legality of the climate fund. The problem is that the ruling not only prevents the transfer of 60 billion that we mentioned before, but also prevents these types of funds from being used in the future, and has put those that already exist in their sights. And remember that we are not talking about little amounts, but about almost 900 billion euros. And there's even more. The problem is that this tap on the hand to Scholz does not exactly come at a good time for the German economy. Check it out.
German factory shuts down.
About 100 years ago, in 1923, one of the biggest hyperinflations in history was unleashed in Germany. A single US dollar was equivalent to 1 trillion marks. And remember that at that time, there were no credit cards. So, to buy a simple loaf of bread, people had to go to the store with a wheelbarrow full of bills. Today, of course, things look a lot different. But the German economy is not going through its best moment either. Today, even France seems to be doing better. Germany, the economic giant, now looks more like a sleepless, tired, and disoriented giant than a real economic powerhouse. And why do I say this? Well, you see, in 2023, the German economy closed in the red, in recession, and 2024 doesn't look like it's going to be much better. And what is even worse, so far there is no light at the end of the tunnel.
After a very successful period since 2012 and these years of crisis, Germany is a tired man after a long night. The recessionary conditions, which have been dragging on since late 2022, look set to continue this year, 2024.
Visualeconomik community, Germany is undergoing what might be known as the Eastern Gambit, a strategy composed of 3 major economic moves. When Merkel decided in 2011 to phase out all nuclear power plants in the country, she was not even able to imagine what could happen. From that moment on, the dependence on Russian gas grew steadily to the point that Germany became addicted to Russian fuels. All the eggs were put into the Russian basket, but who cared? Russian gas was cheap, and that was good for families, and especially for the country's large industrial enterprises. With cheaper energy, wages and profits could be higher. However, the war in Ukraine changed everything. everything. When Russian gas began to disappear from the pipelines, the German economy was faced with a serious problem. If it did not act quickly, the country could collapse. And do you know what? That's where the Germans did a tremendous job. They got down to work and managed to replace Russian gas in record time. But there was one problem. The price of energy skyrocketed, and that affected both the pockets of families and the competitiveness of their companies. This was the first move of the Eastern Gambit. It may surprise you, but German companies have an even bigger problem than energy. They are unable to find talent. There is a huge shortage of qualified professionals. The German population has aged. Many of the immigrants who have arrived are not as highly skilled, and companies are now faced with very high wages and, above all, labor shortages in key positions. For example, 77% of companies report difficulties in hiring technology-related personnel. Highly skilled international workers often don't want to move to Germany, despite being a very rich country with many jobs and apparently the opportunity to build great careers. Germany does not seem to be an attractive place for highly skilled workers. As we already told you on Visualeconomik, it ranks much worse than the rest of its comparable countries. It does not reach the extreme of Japan, but it is an anomaly.
Germany is one of the OECD countries with the lowest barriers to immigration for highly skilled workers. However, the number of immigrant workers from outside the EU and the European Free Trade Area, EFTA, it receives is 25,000 per year, about 0.02% of the population. The rate of skilled immigrant workers received by Australia, Denmark, Canada, and the United Kingdom is 5 to 10 times higher.
This report is from 2013, but since then, things have been getting worse. Clearly, this is a problem. Of course, the coup de grace is the third move in this gambit. Visualeconomik viewers, this is the third and crucial move in this whole economic crisis. Cost problems and lack of workers have now been joined by Chinese competition. You see, when China joined the World Trade Organization at the turn of the century and started exporting like there was no tomorrow, many Western companies were hit hard, particularly in the United States. However, this was not the case in Germany. Teutonic production was so advanced that Chinese companies were not really competition. Quite the contrary. The Chinese giant became a juicy market for their exports. For example, the newly wealthy Chinese were going crazy for the latest models from Mercedes, BMW, and Porsche. As a result, the Teutonic economy recorded a current account surplus of 7.44%, compared to just 1.65% for China. In other words, German industry did much more business in international trade than Chinese industry. For example, German exports to China almost doubled after the 2008 financial crisis. The Chinese just couldn't get enough of German products, machines, chemicals, and of course, cars, which is by far Germany's largest industry. However, just when everything was going smoothly, the electric car, the energy transition plans, and the European emission standards, which are the most restrictive in the world, came along to spoil the party. So what happened? Well, the Chinese brands saw their golden opportunity. While German manufacturers grappled with skyrocketing costs, local emissions restrictions, and a hyper-accelerated transition imposed by the European Union, Chinese companies managed to break their stranglehold. In 2022, thanks to the electric vehicle, Chinese car exports increased by more than 50% and surpassed German exports. In fact, right now, they are on the verge of also overtaking Japan to become the world's largest car exporter. And where did all those cars go? Well, to markets that have traditionally been a huge business for German companies, including Europe itself. For example, this car you see on the screen, the MG4, is the second best-selling electric car in the UK. So what does this mean? It means that competition is going to increase, and increase a lot. We are talking about lower margins, tighter pricing, and lower sales if Chinese cars continue to become more popular. And that's not even the worst thing. The worst thing is that now Chinese companies are starting to beat German manufacturers within China itself, which until now was the main market for Teutonic manufacturers like Volkswagen and Mercedes.
Volkswagen runs up against the Chinese wall. Its sales of electric vehicles are slowing down in the Asian giant.
From an economic point of view, Chinese companies have two major advantages. First, at a time of technological disruption, past experience is irrelevant. China does not need to be a combustion engine expert to beat Germany with electric cars. And second, the gigantic size of China, the world's largest automotive market, allows Chinese brands to scale up production and reduce costs quickly. We talked about this at length not too long ago here on Visualeconomik. Well, what is happening with automobiles is happening with other industries as well. Higher energy costs, lack of workers, high wages, and now Chinese competition are toppling Germany's once famous competitiveness. And just at this point, to top it all off, comes the fiscal crisis, the icing on the cake. Why is this a problem? Well, because the adjustment of public spending means that the state will not be able to carry out many of the plans it had to subsidize the modernization of the national economy. In other words, all these problems at once could end up forcing a competitive devaluation in the country. That is, a huge crisis in order to gain enough competitiveness to face the new Asian rivals with a fall in wages, rights, and welfare. It seems German politicians long ago forgot what made them really rich. Instead, they tried to maintain their competitiveness with subsidies and all kinds of privileges for their industry.
Germany plans to subsidize power-hungry industries. Proposal to cover 80% of electricity cost likely to trigger backlash internally and in Europe.
However, following the court decision, this no longer seems possible, and now the government is facing what may turn out to be the perfect storm. The question is, will they open their eyes and move forward with the reforms they need quickly to avoid such a scenario? What would you do? Leave us your answers in the comments and let's start a debate. And now, if you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe to Visualeconomik if you haven't already done so. All the best. See you next time.